Today we will explore one of the darkest and least discussed aspects of military history. What happened to battlefields after the last sword stroke was delivered and the last war cry fell silent? Who cleaned up the dead? Who collected the wreckage? And why did so many battlefields remain as macabre landscapes for years, sometimes decades, after the confrontation? Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine a vast open field under a sky heavy with clouds. The silence is almost absolute, broken only by the wind that carries with it the metallic scent of blood and the sweet odor of decomposition. Where once there was the thunder of clashing shields, the clinking of blades, and the screams of thousands of men in combat, now only the disturbing stillness of a field covered in bodies remains. Thousands of them, scattered across the muddy earth, piled on top of each other, faces turned toward the sky or buried in the mud. Broken weapons, shattered shields, dented helmets, and pieces of armor lie beside their former owners, like pieces of a macabre puzzle that no one wants to assemble. This is the scene that followed practically every major battle of antiquity and the Middle Ages, a scene that heroic accounts and epic chronicles rarely bothered to describe. Chroniclers preferred to narrate the glory of the victors, the courage of the knights, and the cunning of the generals. But they almost never mentioned what came after, the brutal, unpleasant, and often ignored task of dealing with the physical consequences of war. This is the theme we are going to unravel in this narrative. It is not about heroes or villains, brilliant strategies or humiliating defeats. It is about what was left behind when the armies marched away. It is about the dead, the looters, the carrion animals, the peasants who lived nearby, and ultimately nature itself, which took it upon itself to consume what men did not have the courage, time, or interest to remove. To understand how ancient civilizations dealt with their dead in combat, one must first understand that, for many of these cultures, the treatment given to the body of a fallen warrior went far beyond a practical or hygienic matter. It was, above all, a religious and spiritual issue, deeply rooted in the customs and beliefs of each people. In ancient Greece, for example, the idea of leaving a body unburied was considered one of the worst offenses one could commit, both against the dead and against the gods. Greek literature is full of examples that illustrate this belief. In the tragedy by Sophocles, the character Antigone defies the orders of King Creon to ensure that her brother Polynices receives proper funeral rites, even if it costs her own life. This work is not just fiction. It reflects values deeply ingrained in Greek society, where burial was seen as a sacred duty, an obligation that transcended politics, war, and even the law of men. It was a matter of honor before the gods and before the memory of those who had departed. In the context of Greek battlefields, this religious imperative manifested in a very concrete way. After an armed confrontation, it was common for both sides to organize a temporary truce to collect their dead. This practice was not just a gesture of humanity, it was also a tacit recognition of the battle's outcome. When the defeated side requested permission to collect its fallen, it was, in a way, admitting defeat. And when the winning side granted this permission, it demonstrated magnanimity and respect for the customs shared among the Greeks. A notable example of this practice occurred after the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, when Philip II of Macedon defeated a coalition of Greek cities led by Athens and Thebes. Despite the decisive victory of the Macedonians, both sides were able to treat their dead according to their own religious customs. The Athenians collected the bodies of their fallen warriors, and the Thebans did the same with theirs, including the members of the legendary Sacred Band, an elite unit that fought to the last man. Philip, according to ancient accounts, reportedly visited the battlefield after the combat, and was moved to see the bodies of the Theban warriors arranged in formation, exactly as they had fought, shoulder to shoulder, without retreating a single step. The scene reportedly drew tears from the Macedonian king himself, who ordered them to be buried with full honors. A stone lion was erected on the site to mark the collective grave of those soldiers, and this monument can still be seen today in the region of Chaeronea in central Greece. However, not all battle dead received the same treatment. While the warriors of the winning side were generally honored with proper funeral ceremonies, the bodies of the defeated enemies did not always have the same luck. In many cases, the Greek victors concerned themselves only with their own dead, leaving the enemy's corpses exposed to the sun, the wind, and carrion animals. This practice, although condemned by Greek ethics, was not uncommon, especially when the enemy was considered a barbarian, meaning non-Greek. The distinction between Greeks and barbarians played an important role in how the dead were treated. A Greek fallen in battle deserved burial. A Persian, a rebel Theban, or a member of a rival city did not always receive the same consideration. The way the Greeks dealt with the bodies of their warriors varied according to the circumstances. Cremation was a common practice, especially on battlefields far from the soldier's home city. Funeral pyres were erected on the battlefield itself or nearby, and the bodies were burned in ceremonies that could last for hours or even days, depending on the number of dead. The ashes were then collected in urns and transported back to the warrior's hometown, where they received a final burial in public cemeteries or commemorative monuments. In other cases, when cremation was not feasible, the bodies were buried directly on the battlefield, in mass graves or collective tombs. These graves were often marked with stelae, or mounds of earth, serving as permanent memorials to the warrior's sacrifice. One of the most emblematic examples of this practice is the tomb of Marathon, known as the Soros, which can be visited to this day on the plain of Marathon, about 42 kilometers from Athens. After the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, in which a numerically inferior Athenian army defeated a Persian expeditionary force, the 192 Athenian warriors who fell in combat were cremated and buried in a large burial mound erected directly on the battlefield. The tomb, which rises to approximately 12 meters in height and is about 50 meters in diameter, dominates the landscape of the plain to this day. Archaeological excavations carried out on the site confirmed the presence of a thick layer of ash, and calcined bone remains inside the mound, consistent with the practice of mass cremation. This burial on the battlefield itself was an exception to the usual Athenian practice, which consisted of burying the war dead in the Kerameikos cemetery in Athens. The decision to bury the heroes of Marathon at the very spot where they fought and died was a recognition of the exceptional nature of that victory and the sacrifice of those men. As for the thousands of Persians killed in the battle, ancient sources are less clear. Some accounts suggest that the bodies were initially left exposed on the battlefield, possibly buried later in mass graves, although the exact details remains uncertain. The Spartans, for their part, had distinct funeral customs. While most city-states preferred to transport the bodies of their warriors back home, the Spartans frequently buried their dead on the battlefield itself, considering this practice a military honor. Each fallen Spartan warrior was buried with his weapons and armor, and his grave was marked with a simple headstone bearing the soldier's name and the inscription, "In War." A citizen who died outside the battlefield did not receive such an honor, and was buried in an unmarked grave. If the Greeks viewed the burial of the dead as a religious and moral obligation, the Romans adopted an approach that combined military pragmatism with respect for their soldiers. The Roman army, the most efficient war machine of the ancient world, could not afford to leave its dead unburied, not only for moral reasons but also for practical matters of hygiene and troop morale. Roman soldiers contributed a small amount of their pay monthly to a burial fund, ensuring that, in the event of death in combat, they would receive proper funeral rites. This institutionalized practice reflects the importance the Romans placed on caring for their dead. Roman military manuals even established that burial should be completed within 14 days after the battle to avoid contamination of water supplies and the spread of disease. Officers who failed to meet these deadlines could face severe punishment. When time and circumstances permitted, the dead were buried or cremated individually. When this was not possible, collective cremations or burials were carried out, with the bodies being deposited in mass graves. In some cases, when the bodies could not be recovered, cenotaphs were erected as monuments to the memory of the fallen soldiers. But circumstances did not always allow the Romans to care for their dead. In catastrophic defeats, when the army was forced to retreat or was completely annihilated, the bodies of Roman soldiers were at the mercy of the victors and the elements. And it is precisely in one of these scenarios of defeat that we find one of the most disturbing and moving accounts of the fate of the dead on ancient battlefields. In the year 9 AD, deep in the Teutoburg forest, in present-day Germany, 3 entire Roman legions, commanded by General Publius Quinctilius Varus, were lured into an ambush meticulously planned by Arminius, a Germanic leader who had served in the Roman army itself and intimately knew the tactics and weaknesses of his former masters. The ambush was devastating. It is estimated that between 10,000 and 15,000 Roman soldiers perished over several days of combat in the dense forests and treacherous swamps of the region. Varus himself, realizing that all was lost, took his own life to avoid capture. The news of the defeat shook Rome to its foundations. According to the historian Suetonius, Emperor Augustus was so distraught that for months he beat his head against the palace doors, repeatedly exclaiming, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." The date of the disaster began to be observed annually as a day of mourning and sadness. But what happened to the bodies of those thousands of Roman soldiers abandoned in the depths of the Germanic forest? The answer is as disturbing as it is predictable. Nothing. The Romans could not return to the site of the defeat to bury their dead. The Germanic tribes, victorious and empowered, controlled the region, and any attempt to penetrate those forests again would have been suicidal. The bodies of the legionaries stayed where they fell, exposed to the rain, the cold, wild animals, and the slow action of time. The heads of Roman officers were nailed to tree trunks as macabre trophies. The improvised altars of the Germans, where captured tribunes and centurions had been sacrificed to tribal gods, remained untouched in the dark woods. 6 years passed before a Roman army returned to that haunted place. In 15 AD, General Germanicus, the grandnephew of Emperor Augustus and commander of the Roman forces on the Rhine frontier, led an expedition to the Teutoburg forest with the aim of recovering the lost standards and burying the dead. What his soldiers found upon arriving at the site of the ambush was a scene that was forever recorded in the records of Roman history. The historian Tacitus, writing about a century later, described the scene with chilling detail. In the center of the field, scattered everywhere or heaped in piles, were the whitening bones of men, according as they had fled or stood their ground. Near them lay fragments of weapons and limbs of horses. Human heads were nailed to the trunks of trees around them. In the adjacent woods, the barbarian altars could be seen where the Germans had slaughtered tribunes and first-class centurions. Survivors of the original ambush, who accompanied Germanicus's expedition, pointed out the places where the officers had been killed, where the gallows had been erected for the Roman prisoners, and where Arminius had harangued his victorious troops. Germanicus's soldiers, deeply moved, collected the bones of their fallen comrades and buried them in pits. Tacitus recorded that no soldier knew whether he was burying the remains of a relative or a stranger, but they all looked upon those bones as if they were of their own kin and their own blood. Archaeological excavations carried out at the site of Calcaries, identified as the probable location of the battle, confirmed many of the details provided by Tacitus. Researchers found human bone remains that showed signs of having been buried years after death, consistent with the account of the late burial performed by Germanicus. Roman coins marked with Varus's seal, fragments of weapons, pieces of military equipment, and even complete skeletons of army mules were also found, one of which still had a bronze bell around its neck, stuffed with grass to prevent it from making noise during the march, a poignant detail that connects archaeological finds to the narrative of the disaster. If the Teutoburg forest offers an extreme example of what happened when a defeated army could not collect its dead, other ancient battlefields illustrate a different but equally relevant aspect of the post-battle, the systematic looting of corpses. In practically every battle of antiquity, as soon as the combat ceased, the soldiers and followers of the winning army invaded the battlefield to collect everything of value: weapons, armor, jewelry, coins, fine clothing, belts, brooches, rings. Everything was stripped from the dead and the wounded, with an efficiency that rivaled military organization itself. This plundering was not considered theft or dishonor. It was seen as a legitimate part of the spoils of war, a natural reward for victory. The Battle of Cannae, in 216 BC, offers a vivid example of this practice. In what is considered one of the greatest military defeats in Rome's history, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca annihilated a Roman army of monumental proportions. It is estimated that about 50,000 Roman and Italian allied soldiers perished in a single day of combat on the plains of Apulia, in southern Italy. After the battle, Carthaginian troops traversed the field, collecting gold rings and other valuables from the bodies of the fallen Romans. The quantity of rings collected was so great that, according to ancient accounts, Hannibal sent sacks full of them to Carthage as proof of the magnitude of the victory. The bodies, stripped of everything of value, were left on the battlefield. The task of dealing with that mountain of corpses fell to local farmers, who in the following weeks dug trenches up to 4.5 meters deep to bury the dead, using wooden poles to push the decomposing bodies and avoid direct contact. The delay in burial contributed to outbreaks of typhus and dysentery that affected the populations of the region for months. The looting of battlefields was so systematic that, from an archaeological point of view, ancient battlefields are surprisingly devoid of metallic finds. Weapons, armor, and any metal object were simply too valuable to be left behind. Winning armies collected everything they could use or sell, and local residents completed the task, scouring the fields for anything that had escaped the soldiers' attention. What remained, in most cases, were only stripped bodies, shattered wooden shields, broken spearheads, and other objects with no commercial value. This reality explains why modern archaeologists find so few metallic artifacts at ancient battle sites, even when historical sources describe confrontations involving tens of thousands of combatants. But there were exceptions to this rule of universal plunder. In some Germanic cultures, weapons captured from the enemy were not redistributed or sold. Excavations at Illerup Odal in Denmark revealed about 15,000 military objects deliberately destroyed and deposited in a peat bog as a religious offering. Swords were bent, shields broken, spears twisted, everything ritually rendered useless before being cast into the waters as a sacrifice to the gods, revealing that, for some Germanic peoples, the destruction of spoils was a religious imperative. The sanitary consequences of large-scale battles also cannot be underestimated. Thousands of decomposing bodies posed a serious risk of epidemics. Roman military manuals emphasized the need to complete burial quickly, and there were reports of armies that lost more men to diseases caused by uncleaned battlefields than to combat itself. And what about the bodies of the defeated enemies? In most cases, the victors simply did not care. The corpses of the enemy army were abandoned on the battlefield, thrown into pits without ceremony, or left for the local residents to deal with. In extreme cases, the bodies of enemies were deliberately left unburied as a form of humiliation and intimidation. Byzantine military manuals, heirs to the Roman tradition, even recommended this practice explicitly. Emperor Leo VI, in his writings on military strategy, instructed generals to take special care to bury their own dead with honor, but to leave the enemy's bodies as they were in order to demoralize the adversary. This practice of psychological warfare turned battlefields into macabre memorials of defeat, where the bones of enemy soldiers bleached in the sun for years, serving as a silent warning to anyone who dared to challenge the power of the victor. Ancient sources offer disturbing glimpses of these landscapes of desolation. Accounts describe travelers who, passing through battlefields years or decades after the confrontation, could still see human bones scattered across the earth, skulls grinning grotesquely among the undergrowth, and fragments of rusted armor partially covered by grass. These macabre scenarios were not exceptions. They were the norm on many of the battlefields of antiquity, where the dead of the defeated side had not received proper burial. Nature, with its relentless efficiency, eventually took it upon itself to consume the remains, but the process could take years. Carrion animals such as wolves, wild dogs, and vultures were the first to feed on the fallen bodies. Insects completed the work of decomposition, but the bones, being more resistant, could remain visible for decades, a silent and disturbing reminder of the violence that had occurred in that place. In some notable cases, the remains of the battle dead were used for practical purposes by local residents. After one major battle, ancient sources mention that local farmers used the bones of fallen warriors to build fences around their properties. And for years after the confrontation, the region reportedly experienced extraordinarily abundant harvests, largely thanks to the thousands of decomposing bodies that fertilize the soil with organic matter. This macabre yet pragmatic detail illustrates the complex relationship between war, death, and survival that characterized life near ancient battlefields. With the decline of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of medieval kingdoms in Europe, the basic patterns of how battlefields were treated after combat remained fundamentally the same, though now filtered through the lens of the Christian faith. Christianity introduced an additional moral imperative for the burial of the dead, as the belief in the resurrection of the body made care for mortal remains a matter of theological importance. Leaving a Christian body unburied was not just a lack of respect, it was in a sense an affront to the very hope of salvation. Monastic orders and local parishes often played an active role in collecting and burying the battle dead, when armies did not. The Church considered burying the dead as one of the corporal works of mercy, and monks and clerics on several occasions organized the collection and burial of bodies left on battlefields as an act of Christian charity. However, despite this religious imperative, the practical reality of the Middle Ages was not much different from antiquity. Looting the dead remained the first and most urgent activity after the conclusion of a fight. Just as in antiquity, the soldiers and followers of the winning army traversed the battlefield, stripping the corpses of everything of value: armor, weapons, jewelry, fine clothes, coin purses, and any other object that could be sold or reused. The Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most famous visual representations of the Norman conquest of England, clearly shows men collecting swords and removing armor from the dead, while the battle was still unfolding above them. This scene, embroidered on fabric by medieval artisans, offers a vivid window into a reality that written texts of the time often preferred to ignore. And in some cases, the cruelty of the post-battle went even further. Medieval chronicles record that, on several occasions, soldiers of the winning army killed enemy wounded who were too weak to resist, just to be able to strip them more easily of their belongings. Wounded knights, whose armor was particularly valuable, could be killed in cold blood by looters who had no interest in rescuing or treating them. The chivalric ethics that medieval romances celebrated so much existed more in fiction than in the reality of the battlefields. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 offers a revealing example of how the dead could be treated drastically differently depending on which side they had fought for. After the decisive victory of William the Conqueror over the army of King Harold II of England, Norman sources claim that William buried his fallen Norman knights with all due honors. The bodies of the Norman soldiers were collected, washed, and buried in dignified graves, as befitted Christian warriors who had fought for their Lord's cause. But the English dead, including possibly King Harold himself, received very different treatment. According to a contemporary poem, the bodies of Harold's defeated army were left on the battlefield to be devoured by worms and wolves, by birds and dogs. Harold's mother, according to some sources, reportedly offered the conqueror her son's weight in gold to be able to recover him and give him a dignified burial. But the request was initially refused. The Normans, who were in a hurry to consolidate their control over England, may have left the battlefield largely untouched, except for the removal of valuables. Later, an abbey was built on the site of the battle, with the high altar positioned, according to tradition, exactly at the point where Harold was said to have fallen. Battle Abbey, as it became known, served both as a monument to the Norman victory and as a place of prayer for the souls of the dead on both sides. The logistics of burial after major medieval battles was a formidable challenge. When thousands of men fell in a single day of combat, the task of burying them all quickly was almost impossible. Digging pits large and deep enough to accommodate hundreds or thousands of bodies required labor, tools, and time, resources that were not always available to an army that needed to keep marching. In many cases, the responsibility for burial fell to local residents, who were left to deal with the carnage after the armies departed. Peasants, monks, and clerics from villages and monasteries neighboring the battlefield took on the thankless task of collecting and burying the dead, motivated by a combination of Christian duty, fear of disease, and, in some cases, the hope of finding some object of value that had escaped the attention of military looters. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, during the 100 Years' War, offers an example of this dynamic. After the overwhelming English victory over the French army, King Edward III saw to burying his own English soldiers fallen in combat. But the thousands of French dead, including nobles and highborn knights, were largely left to the care of the villagers and monks of nearby towns, who organized the collection and burial of the bodies as an act of Christian charity. The process took days and in some cases weeks, during which the dead remained exposed to the elements and animals. Of all the medieval battles whose archaeological remains have reached us, few are as revealing and disturbing as the Battle of Visby, fought in 1361 on the island of Gotland in Sweden. This confrontation, which pitted the professional army of King Valdemar IV of Denmark against the local militiamen of Gotland, resulted in one of the greatest documented slaughters of the Scandinavian Middle Ages and left an archaeological legacy unparalleled in Europe. To understand what happened in Visby, one must first understand the geographical and political context of the island of Gotland in the mid-14th century. Located in the Baltic Sea between Sweden and the Baltic states, Gotland occupied a strategic position on the trade routes connecting Western Europe to Russia and the East. The city of Visby, in particular, was a prosperous commercial center and a member of the Hanseatic League, the powerful confederation of merchant cities that dominated trade in northern Europe. The island's wealth attracted the attention of Valdemar IV, who sought to restore Danish supremacy in the Baltic and control the region's lucrative trade routes. On July 22, 1361, Danish forces landed on the west coast of Gotland. The invading army was composed of professional soldiers and mercenaries, many of them veterans of the numerous wars and feudal disputes that plagued the Baltic region. These men were equipped with transitional armor, which combined metal plates over vital points and joints with full chainmail, representing the most advanced military technology of the time. On the other side, the defenders of Gotland were mostly peasants and small local nobles whose military equipment was decades or even generations out of date. Many wore chainmail and helmets dating from the late 13th century, equipment that was already considered obsolete by the standards of 1361. The battle, fought in the fields outside the city walls of Visby, lasted only a few hours, but the carnage was extraordinary. The Gotlandic defenders, unprepared and poorly equipped, were no match for the professional Danish soldiers. Historical accounts suggest that about 1,800 defenders were killed in combat. Analysis of the remains revealed that at least a third of the defenders were composed of teenagers and the elderly, people who, under normal circumstances, would never have been called to the battlefield. The presence of so many young and old among the dead suggests the desperation of the Gotlandic defense, which apparently recruited anyone capable of wielding a weapon. After the battle, the citizens of Visby, who had watched the massacre of their countrymen from within the city's fortified walls without intervening, surrendered to the Danes to avoid further bloodshed. King Valdemar imposed heavy tributes on the city and looted several churches and monasteries. But before leaving, there was the matter of the dead. The bodies of the Gotlandic defenders were collected and thrown into large mass graves dug outside the city walls. And it was here that something extraordinary occurred from an archaeological point of view. Due to the summer heat and the large number of corpses, the Danes did not bother to strip all the dead of their armor before burying them. Decomposition had already advanced to the point of making the removal of armor an unpleasant and unprofitable task. As a result, many of the Gotlandic warriors were buried still wearing their chainmail, helmets, gauntlets, and other pieces of military equipment, unintentionally preserving an extraordinarily detailed portrait of the battle and its participants. These dead remained in their pits for more than 500 years, until in 1905, construction workers accidentally discovered the first of the mass graves. Subsequent excavations, carried out between 1905 and 1928, revealed the remains of 1,185 individuals, making the Visby skeleton collection the largest collection of remains from a medieval battle in all of Europe. 5 mass graves were identified outside the city walls. Osteological analyses of the skeletons revealed the devastating brutality of the combat. About 450 wounds caused by cutting weapons, such as swords and axes, were identified on the bones, in addition to approximately 120 wounds caused by piercing weapons, such as spears and arrows. Some skulls showed multiple injuries, suggesting that the wounded fallen on the ground continued to be struck by the victors. Most of the sword and axe blows hit the victims' heads from top to bottom, indicating attacks delivered against opponents who were already on the ground or in a disadvantageous position. Some skeletons showed 5, 6, or even 7 arrow or crossbow bolt wounds, demonstrating the intensity of projectile fire that the defenders faced. The armor found alongside the skeletons revealed a shocking technological disparity between attackers and defenders. Many of the Gotlanders wore mail hauberks and helmets dating from the late 13th century, equipment that had become obsolete by 1361. Some pieces showed signs of repairs and modifications, suggesting they had been passed down from generation to generation as family heirlooms used in times of crisis. The armor, human remains, and weapons recovered from the Visby mass graves are today on display at the Gotland Museum in Visby and the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm, where they continue to fascinate historians, archaeologists, and visitors from all over the world. More recently, the Brazilian digital artist Cicero Moraes performed a facial reconstruction of one of the Visby warriors from a 3-dimensional model of a skull that showed brutal injuries. The bone above the left eye and the cheekbone were shattered, likely by a polearm, and the nose and mouth had been destroyed by an axe blow. The reconstruction touchingly brought back to life the face of a man who died more than 600 years ago, giving him a visual identity that transcends the centuries and the cold statistics of archaeological reports. The Battle of Visby is an exceptional case, not only for the richness of the archaeological finds, but also because most medieval battlefields did not preserve comparable material remains. In the vast majority of cases, the dead were stripped of their armor and belongings before being buried, which means that mass graves, when found, contain only skeletons without the equipment they used in life. Furthermore, locating the mass graves of medieval battles is notoriously difficult. Chronicles of the time rarely provide precise geographical indications of where the dead were buried, and the landscape has transformed over the centuries, erasing many of the marks left by burial. The Battle of Agincourt, fought in 1415, is an example of this difficulty. Medieval accounts describe the digging of mass graves for the French dead, with one chronicler recording that about 5,800 bodies were deposited in 3 deep pits. However, modern archaeologists have been unable to locate these mass graves, and the exact fate of the thousands of French dead remains a mystery. Burning bodies, which had been a common practice in ancient Greece and in some Norse cultures, was relatively rare in the Christian Middle Ages. Christianity, with its belief in bodily resurrection, discouraged cremation, preferring burial of the intact body in consecrated ground. In addition, there were practical reasons to avoid large-scale cremation. Gathering the amount of firewood necessary to burn hundreds or thousands of bodies was an extremely laborious and time-consuming task, especially in regions where wood was scarce or where armies had already consumed local resources. Cremation, when it occurred, was generally reserved for extreme situations, such as plague epidemics, when speed in disposing of bodies was considered more important than respect for traditional funeral customs. It is important to note that the effects of a major battle could be felt in the local landscape for years or decades after the confrontation. Even when the dead were buried, shallow graves were often not enough to contain the remains indefinitely. Rain, erosion, and animal activity could expose bones over time, creating disturbing scenes for travelers and residents of the region. Our traveler from the early 16th century reported finding bones still scattered on the field of Agincourt, nearly 100 years after the battle, remnants of victims who had been buried superficially or who simply had never been buried at all. The Battle of Anchialus, fought in 917 between the Bulgarian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, offers another extreme example of the persistence of battle remains in the landscape. After the Bulgarian victory, the Byzantine dead were left unburied on the battlefield. Even 70 years later, travelers passing through the region could still see the bleached bones of the fallen soldiers scattered on the ground, a silent and macabre memorial to a battle that already belonged to a past generation. This image of battlefields covered in bones, illuminated by the pale light of the sun or the moon, became a recurring topos in medieval literature and imagination, a constant reminder of the fragility of human life and the brutality of war. The environmental consequences of battles also deserve attention. Great battles did not just destroy human lives, they devastated the surrounding landscape. Fields were trampled by thousands of men and horses, crops were leveled, the soil was soaked in blood and covered in debris. Peasants living nearby found their lands unusable for one or more growing seasons, with crops destroyed, livestock stolen, and water sources contaminated by decomposing bodies. War, for these involuntary civilians, did not end with the last sword stroke. There is, however, a positive and unexpected aspect to this dark story. As mentioned earlier, the decomposition of bodies and organic waste from a battle could, paradoxically, enrich the soil with nutrients, resulting in exceptionally abundant harvests in the following years. This phenomenon was observed and documented in antiquity, and the practice of using battlefields as agricultural land after the burial of the dead was relatively common. The Byzantines themselves, in their military manuals, recognized this side effect of war and integrated it into their strategic considerations. Death in this sense fed life, in a cruel but natural cycle that connected the destruction of war to the renewal of the land. Throughout all of antiquity and the Middle Ages, therefore, the fate of battlefields after combat was determined by a complex interaction of religious, practical, economic, and political factors. Victors cared for their own dead as a matter of honor and religious duty. Enemy bodies were treated with less respect, sometimes buried in mass graves, sometimes simply abandoned. Looting was universal and systematic, ensuring that almost nothing of material value remained on the battlefield. Local residents, often the true heirs of the carnage, took on the thankless task of dealing with what the armies had left behind. And nature, with its infinite patience, eventually took it upon itself to erase the last traces of combat, although the process could take years or decades. The question of who, after all, cleaned up ancient and medieval battlefields does not have a simple or single answer. The truth is that cleaning was a fragmented, improvised, and often incomplete process carried out by different actors at different times and with different motivations. First, the soldiers and followers of the winning army traversed the field collecting weapons, armor, and valuables. Then, commanders might order the burial of their own dead, delegating the task to low-ranking infantry soldiers, while enemy dead were thrown into mass graves without ceremony. After the armies departed, local residents took on the task of dealing with what remained, burying ignored bodies and trying to restore their lands. Monasteries and parishes organized burial efforts as an act of Christian charity. And finally, in the last phase, nature took care of what men had not completed. Carrion animals consumed the soft tissues of exposed bodies. Rain and wind eroded shallow graves, occasionally exposing mortal remains. Vegetation grew over and around the bones, slowly incorporating them into the landscape. Over time, battlefields became simply fields again, with their history of violence and death preserved only in collective memory, in the accounts of chroniclers, and, centuries later, in the finds of archaeologists. There is something deeply human in this story of battlefields after the battle. Behind the statistics and the chroniclers' accounts are the stories of thousands of individuals whose bodies were treated as debris to be removed or as resources to be exploited. The soldiers who looted the dead were not necessarily cruel. They were poor men trying to survive in a brutal world. The peasants who buried the bodies were not heroes. They were ordinary people doing what needed to be done to protect their communities. And the monks who organized the burials were religious people fulfilling what they believed to be their most basic Christian duty. Modern archaeology has allowed us to rediscover these forgotten battlefields and give voice to the dead, silenced by history. Excavations at Visby, Calcries, and other sites have revealed intimate details about the lives and deaths of these anonymous warriors, their ages, their health conditions, the weapons they used, and the wounds they suffered. Each skeleton is an individual story, a life interrupted by violence, a body that was looted, abandoned, or forgotten, and which now, centuries later, finally receives the attention it perhaps did not receive at the moment of its death. The battlefields of antiquity and the Middle Ages are monuments to the human condition in its most contradictory aspects. They are places of courage and cowardice, of honor and greed, of religious devotion and brutal indifference. Who cares for the dead when the living are in a hurry to move on? Who remembers those who fell when the victors are already celebrating their glory? The way a society treats its dead is a mirror that reflects its deepest values and its most uncomfortable truths. The battlefields we explored in this narrative no longer exist as we saw them. The Mound of Marathon is today a peaceful park, covered in grass, where tourists take photographs and marathon runners begin their symbolic journey. The Teutoburg Forest is a destination for trails and outings, with a modern museum preserving the archaeological finds of Kalkries. The fields of Visby, outside the old city walls, are today quiet green areas, and the skeletons of the Gotlandic warriors rest under glass in museums, observed by curious visitors from all over the world. But beneath the surface of these appeased landscapes, beneath the green grass and fertile soil, remain the silent traces of a violence that shaped history. Bones that were never found, weapons that were never recovered, stories that were never told. And that is exactly why this story deserves to be told. To remember that, behind every great battle recorded in history books, there was an after, a moment when someone had to look at the carnage and decide what to do with it. That moment is rarely heroic, rarely glorious, but it is deeply real and deeply human. If this narrative has made you reflect on the hidden aspects of history, on the stories that are normally not told, then our work has fulfilled its purpose. Every subscription, every like, and every comment you leave is like one more brick in the construction of this channel. Just as the chroniclers of the past preserved accounts that allow us to look back and understand the lives of those who came before us, your participation helps us continue unearthing and sharing these forgotten narratives. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave your comment on what caught your attention the most, and share this video with someone who, like you, believes that history is not just about the winners and their victories. Because, as we saw today, sometimes the most revealing stories are not in the triumphant accounts of chronicles, but in the silence of abandoned battlefields, where the dead wait, patiently, to be remembered.